Her father pressed her small hand flat against the whitewashed wall of the stove at dawn. The fire had died hours ago. The clay was still warm beneath her palm, warm the way bread is warm, from the inside, slowly, as if the stone were breathing. He tapped the wall with a wooden mallet and told her to listen. Behind the clay, she could hear a hollow channel where heat still moved like a whisper through a sleeping house. 20 years later, she pressed her hand against a cold hearthstone in a cabin where 5 children coughed through the night, and the stone gave back nothing. Marta Derringer had crossed an ocean and half a continent to reach a place that did not want her. The matrimonial notice in the Milwaukee Z Hausfreund had asked for a practical woman, not delicate, able to keep house and 10 children. She had read the insult before she ever read the name. Orrin Vale wanted labor. He said so in ink. She arrived in Huron, Dakota Territory on the 27th of October, 1887, with a trunk that held 2 wool dresses, a set of mason's tools wrapped in oiled linen, her father's spirit level, and $11 in coin. The depot smelled of wet coal and cattle. Sleet ticked against the wagon spokes in the freight yard, and the wind off the prairie hit flat and constant, the kind of cold that does not gust but simply stands against you. Orrin Vale waited beside a buckboard with 5 children arranged behind him like a ragged chorus. The oldest, Clara, was 12, and held the baby on one hip with the practiced grip of a girl who had been doing a mother's work since March. The boys, Judson, 10, Amos, 7, little Thaddeus, 4, stood in patched coats with their hands in their pockets. The baby, Alma, coughed into a shawl cut from a flour sack. Orrin had not cleaned the blood from his sleeve. He had butchered what remained of a half-starved hog that morning, and the stain ran from wrist to elbow, brown and stiff in the cold. His eyes moved across Marta the way a man inspects a draft horse. Shoulders, hands, width of frame. She was narrow. She could see the calculation behind his silence. "This is what 11 months of letters bought me." Clara whispered it before anyone said the word bride. "Are you the cook?" Marta looked past the girl to the wagon bed. No blankets, no food stores. A single lantern with a cracked glass. She said, "I am what your father asked for." The freight driver, Lemuel Pike, had expected to deliver a farm wife to a working homestead. Instead, he watched a thin woman with a mason's level step into a wagon that smelled of old blood and wet children. He told the story in Huron that evening. By the next morning, 3 people had repeated it, and by Sunday the town had a name for her, the German who came to cook for a dead woman's house. The ride northwest took 4 hours, 8 miles of open grass, brown and beaten flat, with the sky sitting low enough to press against the shoulders. Marta counted fence posts. She counted creek crossings. She counted the children's coughs. Alma every few minutes, Thaddeus in clusters, Judson a deep bark that shook his ribs. Orrin did not speak until the 2nd mile. Then he said, without turning, "Alma died in March. Lung fever. The baby came 3 weeks early, and Alma held on 11 days. He meant his first wife. He used her name as if Marta should already know it, as if the dead woman's presence was so large it needed no introduction." Marta filed this. She would learn later that Orrin still set a 6th plate at supper and corrected himself each time. "The cabin is small," he said. 16 by 22. I framed it fast last spring with cottonwood. The boards have shrunk." "Shrunk how much?" He glanced at her. "Enough to see daylight." The cabin appeared at dusk like a wound on the prairie. Raw wood, no paint. A chimney of stacked stone leaning slightly east. The door faced south, but the wind came from the northwest. and Marta could see where snow dust had drifted through the frame, gaps, and collected in gray lines along the interior wall. Inside, one room, a rope-strung bed frame for Orrin, straw ticks on the floor for the children, a table built from a packing crate, 3 stools, a water bucket with a wooden lid, a hearth of fieldstone set against the north wall, its mouth wide enough to stand in, its flue straight as a rifle barrel. The floor was dirt-packed hard, with planks laid over the worst spots. The air smelled of ash, tallow, and the particular staleness of a house where grief has settled into the walls. Marta set her trunk in the corner and walked to the hearth. She did not unpack. She did not ask about supper. She crouched and looked up the chimney throat. The flue was too wide and too straight. A good chimney captures heat in its walls and surrenders smoke. This chimney surrendered everything: heat, smoke, and the warm air from the room itself. Marta could feel the pull on her face, a steady, invisible river of warmth flowing up the stone throat and vanishing into the Dakota night. She held her hand flat in front of the opening. The draft tugged at her fingers. She said nothing. Not yet. The survival math became clear in the first 3 days. Orrin had 1 3/4 cords of mixed cottonwood and ash stacked against the south wall. Cottonwood burns fast and cool, a poor fuel that throws sparks and leaves crete in the flue. Ash is better, but he had little of it. Marta asked how much wood the cabin needed to survive winter. Orrin said 6 cords minimum. Reuben Fielding, the blacksmith, had told him that. 6 cords. He had fewer than 2. The money, $12 in coin. Against that, a $27 debt at Durney's store for seed, flour, nails, and patent cough syrup that had done nothing for Alma's lungs. 2 sacks of flour remained, half a barrel of turnips soft at the edges. The butchered hog, salted badly, would last perhaps 6 weeks if rationed hard. 5 children, 5 mouths that coughed at night in a house that could not hold its own heat. On the second morning, Marta proved what she suspected. She lit a candle and held it near the hearthstones while the fire burned low. The flame bent hard toward the chimney, not flickered, bent as if an invisible hand were pulling it. She moved the candle to the gap beneath the door. The flame bent the same direction. Every crack in every wall fed the chimney's appetite. The fire was not warming the room. The fire was pulling cold air above through the room to replace what it consumed. She walked outside and stood in the wind and looked at the chimney. Heat shimmered above the stones. All that wood, all those hours of Orrin's labor splitting and stacking, pouring out the top of a stone pipe and dissolving into a sky that did not need it. On the 3rd morning, Reuben Fielding rode out. Reuben Fielding was 59 years old, built like a nail keg, with hands that had shaped iron for 30 years, and a voice that carried the authority of a man who had never been wrong about a stove. He had repaired every hearth and cook stove within 20 miles of Huron. He had told Orrin in September that the cabin needed a proper iron cook stove, better chinking, and 6 cords of hardwood. Orrin had bought none of these things because he could not afford them. Reuben arrived on a gray morning with frost on the grass. He did not knock. He walked in, looked at the hearth, looked at the woodpile through the open door, and shook his head. "You're burning a cord a month at this rate," Reuben said. "Maybe more. That flue's pulling like a bellows, and your cottonwood's half green. You'll be out of fuel by Christmas." Orrin stood beside the table. The children watched from the floor. Marta stood near the hearth with her arms crossed. "What do I do?" Orrin asked. "Buy a stove, a good one. Durney's got a used Acme Charter oak for $26. It'll cut your wood consumption in half and give you a cooking surface." I don't have $26. Then cut more wood. Hire a boy from town if you have to. But you cannot heat this cabin through January with what's out there. Reuben pointed at the south wall. That pile is a death sentence, Orrin. He turned to leave and saw Marta for the first time, or saw her as something other than furniture for the first time. You're the one from Milwaukee? From Bessarabia, Marta said. Before that. Can you cook on an open hearth? I can cook on anything that holds fire. Reuben looked at her, then at the hearth, then at Orrin. Get the stove, he said. Borrow if you have to. That chimney is robbing you blind, and the German cooking on it won't change the draft. He left. Marta watched him ride away and said nothing for a long time. Then she asked Orrin, how much does Durney charge for lime? That night, after the children slept, Marta sat on the floor beside the hearth and felt the cold coming through the stones, not from outside, from the stones themselves. The masonry had no depth. It was a single thickness of fieldstone mortared with sandy clay, and it radiated cold inward as fast as the fire could push heat against it. The chimney throat, straight and open, acted as a pump. Every stick of wood Orrin burned accelerated the loss. She remembered her father's hands. Jakob Derringer had built stoves in the German villages along the Black Sea for 30 years. Not iron stoves shipped from factories, clay stoves, brick stoves, massive whitewashed blocks that filled a corner of the house and held fire the way a stone holds the sun, slowly, deeply, releasing warmth long after the flames went dark. In Bessarabia, in the long winters, children slept on the stove benches and woke warm. The trick was never the fire. The trick was the stone. Jacob had taught her 3 things before she was 12. First, a stove's purpose is not to burn wood, but to hold yesterday's fire inside stone. Second, smoke is not waste. Smoke is unburned heat, and a well-built stove makes the smoke surrender that heat before it leaves the chimney. Third, air is a thief, and every crack, every gap, every straight flue is a door the thief walks through. Marta looked at Orrin's hearth and saw all 3 failures at once. She could not afford an iron stove. She could not cut 6 cords of wood in the weeks remaining before deep frost. But she knew how to build something that Reuben Fielding had never seen and Orrin Vale could not imagine. She knew how to build a stove that remembered. The next morning, Marta hung a wet stocking near the hearth and another on a shelf across the room. By afternoon, the stocking near the hearth had frozen stiff at the toe. The draft beneath the door pulled cold air toward the fire so fast that the moisture froze before it could dry. She had Orrin hold a scrap of paper near every crack in the wall. Every scrap pulled toward the chimney. The fire had turned their cabin into a wind tunnel with furniture. Your chimney is stealing from your children, Marta told him. Orrin stared at her. He was not a stupid man, but he had built what he knew how to build, and no one in Dakota Territory had told him that the thing he built was the source of his trouble, not the solution. Marta crouched on the dirt floor and drew with a stick of charcoal. She drew the hearth as it was, an open mouth, a straight throat, heat rising and vanishing. Then she drew what she wanted to build, a masonry heater, not against the wall, in the center of the room, a compact firebox lined with the best fired brick they could find, an outer body of river clay, field stone, and broken brick, 7 feet by 8 feet at the base, 5 feet 4 inches tall. Inside the body, a twisting path for smoke, horizontal channels that forced hot gas to wind through clay and stone before reaching the chimney. The smoke would give its heat to the masonry, and the masonry would hold that heat for hours. 12 hours. 16. Through the night and into the morning, 2 sleeping benches, each 22 inches wide, and raised 30 inches from the floor, extending from the body like arms. The children would sleep on warm stone, a bake chamber set into the upper body where bread could rise from stored heat. A chimney exit at the back, smaller and longer than the old flue, so that by the time smoke reached the outside air, it had given up nearly everything useful. "You burn a short hot fire," Marta said. 20 pounds of wood, 30 at most. You burn it fast and clean. The masonry drinks the heat. Then you close the damper, and the stone gives back what the fire put in, all night, all morning. One fire, not a fire that burns until you sleep and leaves the room cold by dawn. Orrin looked at the drawing on the floor. He looked at the hearth. He looked at the children asleep on their ticks. "How much wood?" he asked. "Half what you use now, maybe less. And if the smoke backs up, then we open windows and fix the draft." "In January?" Marta met his eyes. "If we do not build this, there will be nothing to fix in January." The silence that followed was not agreement. It was the sound of a man measuring the distance between what he knew and what he could not afford to refuse. Nettie Crowell arrived the next afternoon with a pot of broth and a look of practiced sympathy. She was 36, lean from field work, and she had kept her own family alive through 2 Dakota winters with an iron cook stove, careful planning, and a husband who could swing an axe 12 hours a day. She had opinions about how survival worked, and none of them involved tearing out a hearth in November. She found Marta on her knees, chalking measurements on the dirt floor beside the hearthstones. "What in heaven's name are you drawing?" Marta explained. "A masonry heater, clay and stone, internal channels, sleeping benches." Nettie set the broth on the table and looked at the chalk lines. The heater's footprint covered nearly a quarter of the cabin floor. "You'll give up a quarter of the room when there's barely room for the children now?" "The room is already gone," Marta said. "The chimney has it." "Reuben says you need a cook stove and 6 cords." "Reuben is right about the wood. He is wrong about the stove. An iron stove heats the air. The air leaks through every crack Orrin could not seal. By morning, the stove is cold and the wood is gone. I need something that heats the stone. Stone does not leak." Nettie stared at the chalk lines a moment longer. "And if the smoke comes inside instead of going up? Then we will know in December, not January, and we can fix it." "And if it cracks? If the clay splits?" "Then I will mend it. I have mended stoves since I was 10. Nettie looked at Marta's hands, the knuckles already rough, the fingertips clay-stained from testing the riverbank soil that afternoon. She did not say Marta was wrong. She said something worse. "I hope you're right, because those children have already buried one mother." She left the broth and went home. The gossip reached Durney's store before the broth cooled. Elias Durney ran the only general store within 8 miles of Huron and held the paper on half the homesteads in the county. He was 46, thin at the mouth and thick at the ledger, and he understood that a frontier store's real profit was not in goods but in debt. A man who owed you $27 would buy from you at any price rather than risk the note being called. A man who owed you nothing was a man you could not control. Orrin Vale owed him $27. Durney also sold stoves. He had 3 used iron cook stoves in his back room, marked up 60% from what he'd paid a drummer in Sioux Falls. Every homesteader who built with local materials instead of buying iron was a customer he lost twice, once on the stove, once on the fuel and repair parts that followed. The talk at his counter was direct. "Orrin's bride is tearing out his hearth to build a mud oven," said a man buying tobacco. Another said, "Fielding says it'll smoke them like hams." Durney listened. He calculated. Then he rode out to the Vale claim on a cold Tuesday morning and found Orrin in the clay cut near the river, loading wet earth into the wagon bed. The wind was sharp. Durney stayed on his horse and looked down at Orrin, who stood hip-deep in gray clay with a shovel. A man with 5 hungry children ought to swing an axe, not dig mud for a woman's fancy, Durney said. Orrin leaned on the shovel. His face was tight with the particular exhaustion of a man who had been doubted by everyone and was beginning to doubt himself. Marta says the hearth. Marta has been here 9 days. I've sold stoves in this territory for 11 years. I know what keeps a cabin warm, and it is not a pile of river mud. Marta appeared from behind the wagon. She had been sorting stone in the bed, separating smooth river rock from crumbling sandstone. She held a cold iron skillet, the one from the old hearth. "Mr. Durney," she said, "how much wood does it take to make this handle too hot to hold?" "What?" "You sell stoves. You know iron. How much wood to heat the skillet until a man cannot grip it?" Durney frowned. "A good fire. Half an hour." "And when the fire dies, how long does the handle stay hot?" 10 minutes, 15. 10 minutes. Marta set the skillet on the wagon gate. "Now put your hand on a church wall in February. In Odessa, the stove behind that wall burned its last fire at midnight. The wall is warm at noon. That is the difference between iron and masonry. Iron forgets heat. Stone remembers it." Durney said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "This isn't Odessa. This is Dakota territory. Your church walls don't heave in frost. Your clay doesn't freeze in the form. And your husband doesn't owe me $27. He looked at Orrin. "The note comes due in February, Vale, whether the mud idol works or not." He turned his horse and rode back toward town. Orrin stood in the clay pit and looked at Marta. She could see the doubt in his shoulders, in the way the shovel tilted against his hip. "He's right about the note," Orrin said. "He is right about the note," Marta agreed. "He is wrong about everything else." She climbed into the wagon bed and began stacking stone. "Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who could only see the risk, not the reason?" Marta continued because her father had taught her that poor people survive by keeping what rich people waste. Heat is not created by burning more wood. Heat is created once and then either kept or lost. Every wealthy house in Bessarabia kept its heat in thick walls and deep stoves. Every poor house lost its heat through thin walls and hungry chimneys. The difference between the living and the dead was not who had the most fuel. It was who wasted the least. She had not come to Dakota territory to be pitied. She had come because in Bessarabia her skill was treated as her father's shadow. Jacob Derringer built stoves. His daughter watched. That was the accepted order. When Jacob died, the village hired a man from Tarutino to finish his last commission. Marta had built the firebox arch herself at 14, and the man from Tarutino took the payment. Here, the danger gave the skill a name. No one in Huron knew what a masonry heater was. No one would tell her she was doing her father's work and should stop. The cold did not care whose daughter she was. It cared only whether the stone held heat. Construction began on November 3rd. Marta ordered the old hearth dismantled stone by stone. This was the moment Orrin nearly refused. The hearth was poor, inefficient, a thief of warmth, but it was the only heat they had. Tearing it down meant committing to the new design before a single brick of it existed. It meant nights of pure cold while the masonry rose. They pulled the first stone at dawn. By mid-morning, the chimney was down to chest height, and the north wall stood exposed. Behind the old chimney breast, they found what the builder had never sealed, a crack in the framing 2 fingers wide, running from sill to plate. The wind entered the house like a river. Ash blew across the children's beds. The temperature inside the cabin dropped below the temperature outside because the draft through the crack accelerated through the room. Clara wrapped the three youngest in every blanket they owned and held them near the cook fire Marta had built in a tin pail outside the door. The smoke rose and bent south. The wind was from the northwest, and it was not stopping. Marta sealed the crack with clay and straw before noon, but the damage was done to Orrin's confidence. He stood in the half-demolished cabin with stone dust in his hair and said, "We should have kept the hearth until the new one was ready." "The hearth was the reason you needed 6 cords," Marta said. "Now you need 3, but only if we build fast." Orrin looked at the rubble. He looked at the crack, now packed with clay. He looked at the tin pail throwing sparks outside the door, while his children huddled around it. "How fast?" he asked. 4 weeks, maybe 5. 5 weeks. That put completion at December 8th. December was survivable without deep cold. January was not. If the stove was not firing by Christmas, the margin was gone. Marta began laying the foundation that afternoon. She and Orrin dug below the plank line, 18 inches of hard-packed earth, and rammed a bed of gravel and field stone 6 inches deep. The pad would carry the stove's weight and protect the clay body from frost heave. Every shovelful of dirt went outside. Every stone was tested by hand. Marta rejected 3 loads before she found gravel with the right compaction. The cold came through the open cabin and made the work vicious. Marta's knuckles split on the second day. Orrin's right shoulder, already sore from months of splitting wood alone, swelled until he could not raise the arm above his head. Clara burned supper because no one had time to watch the pot, and the burnt smell mixed with stone dust and cold air until the cabin smelled like a quarry fire. By November 5th, the foundation pad was done. Marta marked the stove's footprint in chalk on the gravel, 7 feet by 8 feet. In the center of their 16 by 22 room, it looked enormous. It looked like a tomb. Nettie's voice echoed, "You'll give up a quarter of the room." But Marta could feel the crack sealed behind her, and she could count the wood that remained against the south wall, and she knew the arithmetic had only one answer. She began laying the first course of stone. On November 7th, 2 days into the foundation work, a wagon sank in the clay cut near the James River. Orrin had gone to load another haul of building clay, and the left rear wheel dropped into soft ground up to the axle. He stood in freezing mud and cursed while the horses stamped and pulled uselessly against the drag. That was when Peter Pechka appeared. Peter was 64 years old, Norwegian, built like a fence post, narrow, hard, and set deep. He had come to Dakota Territory in 1871 to dig wells and set stone, and he had done both for 16 years with the precision of a man who believed that plumb lines were moral instructions. His hands were enormous, scarred at every knuckle, and he carried a wooden mallet on his belt the way another man might carry a knife. He was walking the river road looking for a seam of blue clay he remembered from a well job 3 years back. He saw Orrin's wagon and walked over without hurrying. "You're set too deep," Peter said. "Unhitch the off-horse and pull the front axle first." They freed the wagon in 20 minutes. Peter did not ask what the clay was for. He watched Orrin load the wagon bed, then walked to the pile Marta had rejected the day before, a heap of sandy bank clay left at the cut's edge. "Your woman sorted this out?" "She said it was too sandy." Peter picked up a fistful of the rejected clay and squeezed it. It crumbled at the edges. He nodded slowly. "She's right. Too much sand, not enough binder. It'll shrink and crack in a week." He looked at Orrin. "What's she building?" "A stove. A clay stove with channels inside." Peter's expression did not change. He set the crumbled clay down and wiped his hands on his coat. "She knows ovens," he said. "She doesn't know this ground." That was how it started. Not charity, Not kindness, exactly. Recognition. Peter had watched a woman reject bad material from 50 yards away by the way it held its shape, and that was the language he spoke. He rode back to the Vale claim the next morning with his tools. Peter's first lesson came within an hour. Marta had mixed her first test batch, river clay with chopped straw, the way her father had mixed stove mud in Bessarabia. She formed a brick the size of a loaf and set it beside the stovepipe to dry. By evening it had cracked straight down the center, a clean split that opened like a mouth. Peter broke the test brick in half and held the pieces for Marta to see. The interior was smooth and glassy where it tore, no tooth, no grain. Dakota clay is not your clay, he said. The river lays it in sheets, too fine, too tight. It dries fast on the outside, and the inside stays wet, and the wet pushes out. What does it need? Sharp sand. Not river sand, that's round. You need crushed sand with edges, an old mortar if you can find it, ground fine, and less straw. Cut it shorter. 1 inch, not 3. They mixed a second batch that afternoon. Peter showed Marta how to fold the sand into the clay with a shovel, turning the pile the way a baker turns dough. He did not explain why. He worked, and she watched. And then she worked, and he watched. And when the second test brick held its shape overnight without cracking, he said, "Now you know this ground." It was the beginning of a partnership that neither of them named, but both of them needed. November passed in a blur of mud, stone, and shrinking daylight. The stove rose. Marta laid the firebox arch on November 17th, using the 120 Soundfire bricks they had bought on credit, the only purchased material in the entire structure. The rest was river clay, fieldstone, broken brick, salvaged from a wash house that had burned near Wessington Springs, sand from a gravel bar, and lime that Marta bargained from a farmer's wife in exchange for mending a cracked chimney. Every day cost something physical. Marta's hands bled at the knuckles and would not heal because the clay pulled moisture from her skin faster than it could close. Orange Shoulder forced him to work left-handed. Clara, who had quietly begun cutting straw to the exact 1-inch length Peter specified, sliced her palm on a straw knife and wrapped it without telling anyone until Marta saw the blood-soaked rag at supper. The children thinned. The turnips softened. The hog meat grew salt hard and had to be soaked before it could be chewed. Alma coughed less, but only because the cold air outside the blanket cocoon kept her lungs too tight to expand fully. Progress markers appeared on the cabin wall in Marta's chalk. November 10th, foundation and first 3 courses done. November 17th, firebox arch set, flue connection roughed. November 23rd, first sleeping bench formed, channels half closed. Each date was a small victory and a reminder of what remained. The smoke channels, the winding internal path that would force hot gas to surrender its heat before escaping, were the most difficult work. Each channel had to be smooth enough to avoid creosote buildup, tight enough to slow the gas, and wide enough to prevent blockage. Marta built them with her hands inside the body of the stove, reaching through access holes that she would later seal with removable clay plugs. Peter checked every channel with a candle flame. If the flame pulled evenly through the passage, the draft was right. If it flickered or died, there was a blockage or a leak. On November 25th, a channel in the upper body failed the candle test. Marta had to break open the outer wall, clear a clay fold that had sagged into the passage, rebuild the section, and reseal it. She lost 2 days. The weather was turning. Snow fell on November 28th and did not melt. The clay pit froze at the surface and had to be broken with a bar each morning. Peter brought a tarpaulin to cover the fresh mix, but the edges froze overnight and the straw in the exposed clay turned brittle. On December 1st, the smoke channels were closed. Marta sealed the last access hole and pressed her ear against the stove body. She could hear the wind moving faintly through the internal passages, a low murmur like breath through a sleeping throat. On December 5th, she mixed the final lime wash, water, slaked lime, and a pinch of salt, and brushed it over the entire surface of the stove. The white coating covered the rough fieldstone and clay patches and gave the massive structure the appearance of something intentional, something that belonged. The stove sat in the center of the cabin like a white altar, 7 feet by 8 feet, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 2 bench wings extending east and west, each 22 inches wide, raised 30 inches from the floor, a bake chamber near the top, a compact firebox at the front lined with fired brick, its iron door salvaged from Reuben Fielding's scrap pile, a clean-out access at the back, a flue exit that connected to the new chimney Orrin had extended with salvaged tile, braced with strap iron per Peter's instruction. It was enormous. It was strange. It filled the room the way a body fills a coffin, completely, unavoidably, with no space left for doubt about what it was. Clara touched the white surface and pulled her hand back. "It's cold," she said. "It has never had a fire," Marta said. "It does not know what it is yet." The stove needed to dry. The clay body held moisture that could turn to steam and crack the structure if heated too fast. Marta wanted a week of slow warming, tiny fires, barely more than candle flames, to drive the moisture out gently. But the calendar said December 5th, and the sky said the mild days were ending, and the wood stack against the south wall said there was no margin left for patience. She would light the first fire in 3 days, December 8th, and if the smoke came inside instead of winding through those careful channels and surrendering its heat to the clay, if the draft failed, if the channels collapsed, if the body cracked, then she would have destroyed Orrin Vale's only hearth, spent his last credit on bricks, and filled his cabin with a monument to her father's memory that could not keep 5 children alive. The temperature dropped that night. Marta lay on the floor beside the cold white stove and listened to the children cough and the wind test every seam in the walls. 3 days. December 6th. 2 days before the first firing. Marta spent the morning inspecting every seam on the stove's exterior, pressing her thumb into the lime wash surface and feeling for soft spots where the clay had not cured. She found 3. 2 were shallow. Surface moisture that would dry in the first gentle firing. The 3rd was deep, a fist-sized patch on the lower back wall where she had packed wet clay around a field stone that did not sit flush. She dug it out with a flat stick, mixed fresh clay with sharp sand, and repacked it. Peter watched from the doorway. "You are worried about the wrong wall," he said. "Which wall should I worry about?" He pointed at the chimney connection, the joint where the stove's internal flue exited the body and connected to the vertical chimney pipe. The joint was wrapped in a collar of clay and iron strap, but it sat at an angle where the weight of the upper body pressed unevenly. If that joint opened during thermal expansion, smoke would leak into the cabin at the worst possible point, above head height, invisible until the room filled. Marta climbed onto a stool and pressed her face close to the collar. She could see a hairline gap where the clay had pulled back from the iron during drying, a fracture no wider than a thread. Enough. She sealed it with wet clay mixed with wood ash, which Peter said would calcium harden in heat faster than raw clay. She wrapped the seal in a strip of linen soaked in lime water and tied it with wire. It was not elegant. It would hold. "Or it won't," Peter said, "and you'll know in the first hour." December 7th brought visitors Marta had not invited. Reuben Fielding returned, this time not to advise Orrin, but to look at the stove. Word had reached him through Nettie Crowell that the German woman had built a structure the size of a wagon inside the cabin, and Reuben's professional curiosity, or professional suspicion, would not let it rest. He stood inside the door and stared. The white mass filled the center of the room. The sleeping benches extended on each side like arms open for children. The bake chamber's small iron door caught the light from the south window. The firebox opening, lined with red-orange brick, was smaller than his spread hand, absurdly small compared to the gaping hearth mouth that had been there before. "That's the firebox?" Reuben said. "That is the firebox," Marta said. "A man couldn't fit a proper log in there." "A proper log is not needed. 20 pounds of split wood, 30 at most, burned fast and hot." Reuben crouched and looked into the firebox. He could see the first turn of the internal channel, a smooth clay wall curving away from the burn chamber and disappearing into the mass. He put his hand into the opening and felt the draft. It pulled gently, steadily, the way a well-built flue should. "The draft is right," he admitted, "but draft in a cold stove means nothing. Wait until you fire it and the channels heat unevenly. The hot side expands, the cold side doesn't, and the whole thing cracks like a dropped pot." "The channels are tapered," Marta said. "Wider at the firebox, narrower at the chimney. The hottest gas moves through the widest space. The expansion is distributed." Reuben looked at her. He had not expected technical language from a woman who, 9 days before, he had dismissed as a cook who would not change the draft. He stood up, brushed his knees, and said the thing that authority figures say when they cannot find a flaw but cannot admit they are impressed. "We'll see," he said. "December is not January." He left without wishing her luck, but he did not repeat his warning about smoking them like hams, and Marta noticed the omission. December 8th, first firing. Marta woke before dawn and lay on the floor in the dark, listening. The wind was light from the south. Good. A south wind meant the chimney would draw naturally, without crosswind pressure on the flue cap. She could hear Alma breathing in short, wet pulls. Thaddeus mumbled in his sleep. The cabin was 31 degrees by the spirit thermometer Marta had hung on a nail near the children's bench. 31 degrees inside a house with 5 children sleeping in it. She rose and built the fire in the dark. Not a fire. A gesture. A handful of kindling, thin splits of dry ash, each the width of a finger. A curl of birch bark for tinder. She lit it with a sulfur match and fed it 1 stick at a time, keeping the flame low and the heat modest. The firebox glowed orange at the back wall. Smoke rose into the first channel and vanished. No smoke entered the room. She waited, fed another stick. The fire crackled softly, an intimate sound after weeks of the old hearth's roaring appetite. The chimney drew. The smoke moved through the channels. She could hear it, a faint whisper behind the clay walls like wind through a closed window. The children woke and gathered around the stove. They expected warmth. They felt nothing. The white surface was the same temperature as the room. Clara touched it and frowned. Judson pressed his ear against the bench and said, "I can hear something inside." "Stone is slow to trust," Marta said. "Wait." She fed the fire for 2 hours, 20 pounds of split wood piece by piece, keeping the flame hot but contained. The firebox brick turned from orange to pale yellow at the edges. The iron door handle grew warm, then hot, but the outer surface of the stove remained cool to the touch. Orrin came inside from chores, stamping frost from his boots. "Nothing?" he said. "Put your hand here." Marta guided his palm to the wall directly behind the firebox, on the opposite side of the clay mass. It was faintly warm, barely perceptible, like standing near a horse. That's it? That is the beginning? By noon, the wall behind the firebox was warm enough to feel at arm's length. By afternoon, the warmth had migrated outward through the mass. Marta could track it by touching the surface at intervals, and each hour the warm zone spread farther from the firebox, creeping through the channels like a slow tide. The sleeping bench on the east side began to warm at 3 in the afternoon, 6 hours after the fire was lit. At supper, Marta let the fire die. She closed the damper, a flat iron plate set into the flue exit, and sealed the firebox door. The stove was on its own now. Whatever heat it held, it would keep or surrender. The children went to bed on the benches. Alma, the baby, lay on the east bench wrapped in a blanket with Thaddeus curled beside her. Within an hour, Thaddeus kicked the blanket off. The bench was warm beneath him. Not hot, not stove surface hot, but warm the way sun-baked stone is warm at dusk. A deep, even heat that did not sting or fade. Marta hung the spirit thermometer on a nail above the east bench. At 9 in the evening, it read 58 degrees. The far wall, away from the stove, read 39. A 19-degree difference across a cabin 16 feet wide. By dawn, 9 hours after the fire died, the bench thermometer read 54. It had lost 4 degrees in 9 hours. The far wall read 35. Marta wrote on the mantel in chalk, Deck 8, 20 lbs wood. Bench 58 eve, 54 dawn. Wall 39, 35. She lit the second fire. The second day's results were better. The mass had retained residual heat from the first firing, so the second charge started from a higher baseline. By evening, the bench read 64 degrees. By dawn, 61. Marta added a second line of chalk marks. The third day she reduced the wood charge to 18 pounds. The bench held 62 at dawn. The children stopped coughing at night. Not because they were cured. Alma's lungs were still compromised, and Judson's bark would linger until spring, but because they were sleeping in warm air for the first time since October. Warm air does not cure sickness, but cold air feeds it, and the cold air was gone from the sleeping benches. Orrin noticed something else. The draft under the door had stopped. Without the open hearth pulling air through every crack, the cabin's natural leaks became manageable. The wind still pressed against the north wall, but it no longer flowed through the room. The stove did not create a vacuum. It sat in the center of the space and radiated heat outward in every direction, and the air around it moved in slow, gentle convection instead of the violent current the old chimney had demanded. On the fourth day, Nettie Crowell came back. She did not bring broth this time. She brought questions. How thick was the bench? How long did the fire burn? How much wood per day? She pressed her palm against the east bench and held it there for 10 seconds, and when she pulled it away, her expression had changed from skepticism to something harder to name. Not belief, exactly. Recognition. The bench was warm, and the fire was out, and the room did not smell of smoke. "The children look better," Nettie said. "The children are warm," Marta said. "Reuben says December is not January." "Reuben is correct, but December is what we have." Nettie left without promising anything. She came back 2 days later with a sack of dried beans and did not explain why. By mid-December, the stove had proven 2 things and failed to prove a third. It held heat. It burned half the wood the old hearth had consumed, but it had not yet faced cold below 0, and everyone who had survived a Dakota winter knew that the mild cold of December was a different animal from the killing cold of January. Reuben Fielding said it plainly to anyone who asked, "The mud box works in December. So does a campfire. Ask me in February." Durney said it differently. He told settlers at his counter that Orrin Vale's wife had filled the cabin with a clay monument that would crack in the first hard freeze and poison the family with smoke. He said it with the measured concern of a man who sells iron stoves and holds a $27 note. I'm not wishing them harm, Durney told the men at his counter. I'm telling you what I've seen happen to mud chimneys in this territory. They crack. They always crack. Marta heard the gossip through Clara, who heard it from the Crowell children, who heard it from their mother, who had heard it at the store. Marta said nothing. She kept her chalk marks on the mantel and added wood weights, burn times, and bench temperatures in a column that grew longer each day. Snow fell before Christmas. Not the killing snow, the preliminary snow, the kind that settles on the prairie like a wool blanket and insulates the ground while the sky prepares something worse. Rail freight into Huron slowed. Wood prices rose. A cord of seasoned oak that had cost $4 in October now cost $6.50, and there was none to be had closer than Wessington Springs. Orrin counted the remaining wood, 1 1/4 cords. At the old hearth's rate, that was 5 weeks. At the stove's rate, it was 10, maybe 12 if Marta kept the charges small. 10 weeks from Christmas put them at the end of February, if the stove held, if the clay didn't crack, if the coal didn't find a way inside that the heat couldn't answer. Marta traced the chalk column with her finger and did the arithmetic she would not say aloud. They had enough wood for the stove. They did not have enough wood for the stove and a failure. If the masonry body cracked open in January, there would be no fallback, no reserve, no second plan. The old hearth was rubble in the yard. The iron stove at Durney's store cost $26 they did not have. The stove had to hold. There was nothing behind it. On January 11th, 1888, the sky did something wrong. The day broke warm, not mild, warm. 40 degrees at mid-morning, with a soft wind from the south that smelled of wet grass and mud. Snow melted off the cabin eaves in long drips. The children wanted to go outside. Orrin considered riding to Huron to bargain for flour, because the roads would be passable and the mild air felt like a gift. Marta distrusted the air. She had grown up in a land of steppe winters, and she knew what warmth in January meant. It meant the atmosphere was being pushed, displaced by something behind it, something cold enough and heavy enough to shove mild air ahead of it, like a herald running before an army. In Bessarabia, her father had called these warm spells trügerische Wärme, treacherous warmth. She told Orrin to stay. He asked why. She said, because the sky is lying. He laughed. Not cruelly, the way a man laughs when worry has been his only companion for 3 months, and someone offers him a different feeling. He did not go to Huron. He split wood in the yard in his shirt sleeves and stacked it inside the door. Marta loaded the firebox with a full 30-pound charge at 11 in the morning, heavier than usual, and earlier. She closed the damper halfway to let the fire burn hot and long, pushing maximum heat into the masonry. She filled the water bucket. She brought in the last of the salt pork. She counted heads. Clara at the table, Judson outside helping Orrin, Amos and Thaddeus on the bench, Alma asleep in the cradle Orrin had built from a flour barrel. At noon, Judson asked to walk to the Crowells with a pail of the bean soup Marta had made that morning. The Crowells were a mile east. Judson was 10, strong, and knew the path. Marta hesitated. The sky was still clear, the wind still warm. She let him go. Peter Brecka arrived at noon. He had come to check the chimney brace, which had been groaning faintly in high winds. He climbed onto the roof with a wrench and tightened the strap iron bolts while Orrin held the ladder. Peter came down and looked west. His face changed. "Get inside," he said. The western horizon had become a wall, not clouds, a wall, a solid line of white-gray that stretched from north to south without break, rising from the ground to the top of the sky, and it was moving, moving fast. The warm wind stopped as if someone had closed a door, and in the silence that followed, Marta heard a sound she had never heard before, a low, constant roar, like a river running through the air itself. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the time it took Orrin to cross the yard. The blizzard hit the cabin at 12:47 by Marta's clock. She knew the time because she looked at the clock when the first gust struck the north wall hard enough to knock the water bucket off its shelf. The world outside vanished. Not dimmed, vanished. The south window went white. The sound was not wind. It was pressure, a physical weight of moving air and ice that pressed against the cabin walls and found every crack, every seam, every gap that the chinking could not cover. Snow did not fall. Snow drove horizontally, and where it met the cabin, it piled against the north wall at a rate visible to the eye. The temperature inside the cabin dropped from 61 degrees to 48 in the first hour. Marta fed the stove. She loaded a 25-pound charge of split ash and cottonwood into the firebox and opened the draft wide. The fire roared. The firebox brick went yellow-white. Smoke pulled cleanly through the channels. She could hear it moving, faster now, driven by the temperature differential between the superheated gas and the cold masonry. The stove was drinking heat the way a sponge drinks water. Within 40 minutes, the bench temperature stabilized at 56. By the second hour, it climbed to 59. The stove was doing what Marta had built it to do, absorbing a short, intense fire and distributing the heat through 2,000 pounds of clay, stone, and brick. The children pressed against the benches. Alma stopped shivering. Then Orrin looked at the door and said, "Where is Judson?" The silence that followed was the worst sound in the cabin. Judson had left for the Crowells at noon. The storm hit at 12:47. The Crowells' farm was a mile east, across open prairie with no fence line and no windbreak. A 10-year-old boy carrying a pail of soup in a storm that erased the horizon. Orrin went for the door. Marta blocked it. "You will die," she said. "You will walk 30 steps and lose the cabin and die. My son is out there. Your son may be at the Crowells. He may be in the barn. He's not between here and there. No one could stand in this." Orrin's face twisted. The sound of a father's calculations was not arithmetic. It was meat and bone and the weight of a boy he had held at birth. Peter spoke from beside the stove. He had been quiet since the storm hit, his hands wrapped around a cup of water he had not drunk. "Rope," he said. They tied every piece of rope in the cabin together, the well rope, the clothesline, a length of hemp from the barn, a harness strap. 60 feet. Not enough to reach the Crowells. Enough to reach the well post, and from the well post, if the wind allowed, a man might see the barn, and from the barn, the hay road east. Marta tied one end to the door frame. Orrin tied the other around his waist. Peter insisted on going with him. "I will not stand at a stove while a boy freezes," Peter said. "You are 64 years old," Marta said. "I am 64 years old, and I know the ground between here and the Crowells, because I dug their well." They went out. The door opened against wind that took the breath from Marta's lungs, and the two men vanished into white before they reached the end of the rope. If you're invested in this story, stay with us, because the next hour decides whether this house becomes a refuge or a tomb. Marta closed the door and pressed her weight against it. Snow had entered the cabin in the 8 seconds the door was open, a fine driving powder that covered the floor from threshold to table. Clara swept it toward the wall with shaking hands. The 4 remaining children looked at Marta. Amos, 7, understood enough to be afraid. Thaddeus, 4, understood only that his father and the old man had gone into the white. Alma slept on the bench, too young and too sick to know what was happening. Clara knew everything. Her face was the face of a 12-year-old who had already lost a mother and understood exactly what the storm meant for a father tied to a rope. "Keep them on the bench," Marta said. "The bench is warm. Do not leave the bench." Marta turned to the stove. The masonry surface was warm under her hands, steady, deep, patient. The fire in the firebox had burned down to coals. She needed to decide, reload now or wait. She reloaded. 20 pounds of dry ash, split thin. The fire caught fast and the channels filled with the sound of moving gas. The stove drank. Then the chimney groaned. Not the groan of cooling metal, the groan of crosswind hitting the flue cap at full force. The wind was northwest, and the chimney faced northwest, and the pressure differential tried to reverse the draft. Smoke puffed from the clean-out door at the base of the stove, a thin curl that smelled of burning ash and hot clay. Marta remembered Peter's lesson. In crosswind, open the lower draft hard. More air into the firebox means hotter combustion, which means stronger upward pull in the channels, which overcomes the wind pushing down the chimney. A hotter fire fights a harder wind. She opened the draft plate to its widest setting. The fire roared. The smoke puff stopped. But the clean-out door was warm to the touch, which meant the seal was not perfect, and if the wind shifted or gusted harder, the pressure could overcome the draft again. She found the hairline gap, the same joint Peter had warned her about on December 6th, the chimney collar where thermal expansion had opened a crack the width of a thread. The linen wrap was intact, but the clay behind it had dried further and pulled back a fraction of an inch. Marta mixed wet clay with wood ash in her palm, pressed it into the gap with her thumb, and wrapped a fresh strip of linen over it, tying it with the same wire. Her hands shook, not from cold, from the knowledge that the difference between a warm cabin and a smoke-filled death trap was a patch of wet clay the size of her thumb pressed into a crack she could barely see. The seal held. The draft stabilized. The chimney stopped groaning. Outside, the storm tried to take everything. The account of what happened to Orrin and Peter came later, after the wind stopped and the words came back. They followed the rope to the well post. From the well post they could see nothing. Not the barn, not the sky, not each other when more than an arm's length separated them. The wind drove ice crystals into exposed skin with the force of thrown sand. Orrin's left ear went numb in the first 5 minutes and would not recover sensation until March. Peter navigated by memory. He had dug the crowel well 5 years earlier, and he knew the ground the way a blind man knows a room. 20 paces south of the well post, the land dipped into a shallow swale where runoff collected in spring. The swale ran east. Follow the swale, and you hit the crowel fence line. Follow the fence line north, and you hit the barn. They found the fence by falling into it. Orrin struck the top wire with his shin and went down in the snow. Peter pulled him up. They followed the wire hand over hand, leaning into the wind until the barn wall appeared out of the white, like a dark shore rising from fog. Inside the barn, Judson sat against a hay bale with his arms around Will Crowell, Nettie's oldest boy, 13. Both were alive. Both were shaking. Judson had reached the Crowells before the storm, but Will had been returning from the creek when the wall hit, and Judson had found him stumbling in the yard and dragged him into the barn. Will's hands were white. His boots were soaked through, and his feet had stopped hurting, which was worse than pain. Frostbite had taken the color from his fingers and toes, and the tissue beneath was turning the gray-yellow of meat left too long in brine. They could not stay in the barn. The barn was shelter from wind, but not from cold, and the cold was killing cold, not the cold of December, the cold of death, the cold that Reuben Fielding had warned about and Durney had predicted and every settler on the Dakota plains had feared since the first snows of November. Pater tied the boys between himself and Orrin, Judson in front, Will behind, and they went back into the storm, the fence line to the swale to the well post to the rope to the door. Marta heard the thumping before she heard voices. She opened the door, and the wind threw 4 bodies across the threshold in a tangle of ice-crusted wool and frozen rope. Will Crowell could not warm. Nettie's iron cook stove, a mile east, was glowing red with overfire. Marta would learn this later, and the far room of the Crowell cabin was still below freezing because the stove heated air, and the air fled through every crack in the building. Nettie had wrapped her other children in quilts and fed the stove until she ran out of split wood and began breaking a chair. Here, in the Vale cabin, Will lay on the east sleeping bench and shivered so violently that his teeth chipped against each other. His hands were swollen and gray. His feet were worse. Marta had seen frostbite in Bessarabia, had seen her uncle lose 2 toes after a night in a broken wagon, and she knew that the worst thing for frozen tissue was direct heat. Flame would kill what cold had only stunned. She did not put Will near the firebox. She laid him on the bench where the temperature was 61 degrees, a mite warm enough to thaw slowly, cool enough not to damage the tissue further. She wrapped his hands in dry wool loosely and elevated his feet on a folded blanket. She told Clara to keep the other children on the west bench and not to touch Will's hands, no matter how much he asked. Will cried, not from pain. Frostbitten flesh does not hurt until it thaws, and the thawing had only begun. He cried because he was 13 and he was afraid, and the warm stone beneath him was the first thing that had felt safe since the sky disappeared. By dawn, the swelling in his hands had turned from gray to red. Red meant blood returning. Red meant alive. His feet were slower. The toes stayed white through the night and only flushed pink by mid-morning. But he was breathing. He was warm. He had not lost consciousness, and the slow, even heat of the masonry bench had done what a roaring iron stove could not. It had given his body time to recover without shocking the damaged tissue. The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of wind that never dropped below a scream. 3 days of snow so thick that Orrin could not see the woodpile 12 feet from the door and had to follow a rope to reach it. 3 days of the spirit thermometer outside reading numbers that Marta wrote on the mantel in chalk and did not say aloud because the children could read numbers. Inside the cabin, Marta ran the stove in cycles, a 25-pound charge in the afternoon, 20 pounds near midnight, another small charge before dawn. 3 fires per day, totaling 65 to 70 pounds of wood, less than half what the old hearth would have consumed in a single evening. The masonry body absorbed each charge and radiated heat between firings, holding the bench temperature between 59 and 66 degrees. The far wall dropped to the low 30s. The center of the room near the stove stayed in the mid-50s. 7 people lived in a cabin 16 by 22 feet for 3 days, and no one froze. No one burned furniture. No one ran out of wood. On the second night, Marta did the math by candlelight. She had burned roughly 1/6 of a cord in 3 days. At that rate, the remaining wood would last through March, past the thaw, past the danger, past the killing season. On the morning of January 15th, the wind stopped. The silence was so sudden that Alma woke and cried, startled by the absence of the sound that had been her world for 3 days. Orrin opened the door. The snow was chest-high against the north wall and waist-high at the door. The sky was blue in the way that only a sky emptied of all moisture can be blue. Hard, bright, absolute. The temperature was 22 degrees below zero. He looked at the wood pile. He had taken wood from it 3 times a day for 3 days, and the pile had barely changed. He looked at the stove through the open door, the white mass sitting in the center of the cabin, radiating heat it had stored hours ago from a fire that no longer existed. He looked at Marta, who stood behind him with clay dust in her hair and chalk marks on her fingers. He did not say she was right. He said, "I'll bring more wood in." It was the closest thing to belief a man like Orrin Vale could speak. News traveled slowly after the storm, carried by riders following broken fence lines and shoveled paths. The count came in over days. Cattle dead, hundreds across the territory, frozen standing in fields. Sheep dead, thousands smothered in drifts, horses lost, dozens scattered by wind they could not face. People dead. The number grew each day. A school teacher near Yankton had held her students in the schoolhouse when the storm hit and they had survived, but a boy walking home alone had not. A woman near Aberdeen had burned her last furniture and was found alive but unable to walk, her feet destroyed. 2 men near Redfield had tried to reach a neighbor's barn and were found a quarter-mile apart, facing opposite directions. The numbers were not abstract. They were the Crowell's frost-bitten son. They were the empty chair at the Grindheim table 4 miles west, where old Mrs. Grindheim had gone to check the chickens and never came back. They were the silence at the depot in Huron when the freight driver, Lemuel Pike, reported that the family in the sod house near the creek crossing had stopped answering when he called. In the Vale cabin, 5 children slept on warm stone while the woodpile stood nearly intact. In the Crowell cabin, Nettie had burned a table, 2 chairs, and a section of fencing, and her stove had still not kept the far room above freezing. In Durney's store, 17 people had sheltered through the storm, and Durney had rationed his coal so tightly that 2 families huddled in the storeroom and a man lost 3 toes. The stove built of river clay, field stone, broken brick, and a woman's father's knowledge had done what Reuben Fielding's iron could not, what Durney's coal could not, what 6 cords of cottonwood in an open hearth could not. It had held the fire inside the stone, and the stone had held the children. The storm left a territory that looked like it had been beaten and dropped. Drift stood 6 feet high against north-facing walls. Roads vanished under packed snow that would not melt until March. The prairie, which had been brown grass a week earlier, was a white blank stretching to every horizon, featureless except for the dark points of chimneys and the thin smoke lines rising from them. Or not rising where the smoke had stopped. Marta cleaned the ash from the firebox on January 16th and ran a brush through the fur smoke channel. A 1/4 inch of fine sight had accumulated, normal for a month of daily firing. She scraped it into a pail. The channels were clear. The clay body showed no cracks. The lime wash had yellowed slightly near the firebox, but was intact everywhere else. She wrote the final storm entry on the mantle. Jan 12-15. 3 days. 200 LEBS wood total. Bench never below 59. Will Crowell recovering. All children alive. Reuben Fielding came on January 18th. He did not announce himself. He walked in when Orrin opened the door, the way a man enters a building he intends to inspect, not visit. His coat was crusted with ice at the collar and his face was wind raw. He had ridden 3 miles in 12 below cold to see the stove. He walked the full perimeter of the masonry body. He touched the bench surface with both palms, held them there, moved to the next section. He crouched at the firebox and looked inside at the brick lining. He tapped the outer wall with his knuckle in 3 places. The sound came back dense and solid, no hollow ring, no crack resonance. He found the chimney collar repair. He looked at the linen wrap and the wire and the clay patch that Marta had pressed in with her thumb during the worst hour of the worst storm. He touched it. It was hard, calcium set, bonded to the iron. He stood up. "I was wrong about the mud," he said. Marta was rolling dough at the table. She did not look up. "You were wrong about the fire." Reuben waited for her to explain, but she did not explain. She pressed the dough flat and cut it with a tin edge. The statement hung in the room the way heat hangs in stone, present, undeniable, not going anywhere. "The fire's not the heat," Reuben said slowly, working it out aloud. "The fire is how you put heat into the stone. The stone is the heat." Marta looked up. "Yes." It was the first time since her arrival that a man in Huron had repeated her principle back to her in his own words. Reuben Fielding was not converted in the way a skeptic in a story converts. Suddenly, completely, with a speech of apology. He was converted the way a blacksmith learns a new alloy, by testing it, finding it sound, and filing the knowledge beside everything else he knew. He would never build a masonry heater himself. He did not have the clay skill. But he would stop telling people the method was foolish, and in a community where one man's authority shaped every hearth decision within 20 miles, that silence was worth more than praise. He asked 2 questions before he left. The first, "How much wood for the 3 days?" Marta told him. He did the math against his own stove's consumption and said nothing, but his jaw tightened. The second, "Can it be built smaller? For cabin half this size?" "It can be built any size," Marta said. "The principle does not change. The mass changes." He left. He did not wish her well. He did not need to. The inspection was the respect, and Marta recognized it because her father had received the same inspection from the same kind of man in a different country 30 years before. Nettie Crowell came the next day. She did not bring broth or beans. She brought a piece of paper and a pencil. Will's feet had kept their color. The toes that had been white for 12 hours on the masonry bench were pink now, swollen but alive. The slow, even thaw had saved tissue that a blast of stove heat would have killed. Nettie knew this the way a mother knows what saved her child, not through medical theory, but through the fact of his walking, stiffly, painfully, but walking. She sat at Marta's table and asked questions for an hour. How thick should the bench be? What clay? What sand? What proportion? How long are the channels? How big is the firebox? Where does the chimney connect? How do you seal the clean-out? What happens if the wind reverses? Marta answered every question. She drew the channel pattern on the table in flour, a winding serpentine path that forced hot gas through 4 full turns before reaching the chimney. She drew the firebox proportions. She drew the bench cross-section showing how the channels ran beneath the sleeping surface, warming the stone from below. Nettie copied everything. Her lines were shaky and her proportions were wrong, and Marta corrected them patiently, the way Jakob Derringer had corrected hers when she was 9. You could sell this, Nettie said. Sell what? The pattern, the knowledge. People would pay. Marta shook her head. My father never charged for the drawing. He charged for the labor and the materials. The knowledge belongs to anyone cold enough to need it. This was not generosity. It was philosophy. The stove setter's code from the Black Sea villages where Jakob had worked. A heater built from local materials using shared knowledge cost a family nothing but sweat. A heater sold as a proprietary secret cost them dependence. Marta had seen dependence. Dependence looked like a $27 note at Durney's store. Nettie took the flour-dusted drawings home. Within a week, She and her husband had begun stockpiling clay from the same river cut Marta had used. They would build their heater in March, when the ground thawed enough to dig a proper foundation. Other visitors followed. A German-Russian family from near Woolsey, the Espelons, had heard about the stove from a freighter who had seen the chalk marks on Marta's mantle. They came with a wagon and a translator. The wife spoke only Plautdietsch, but she understood masonry the way Marta did, from inheritance. Her grandmother had kept a back oven in the summer kitchen of a Black Sea colony, and the woman's hands moved over Marta's stove surface the way a musician's hands move over a familiar instrument. A second family, the Vick brothers from north of Huron, came because Peter Pechka had told them. They wanted a smaller design. Their cabin was 12 by 14, and a 7 by 8 heater would leave room for nothing but the stove itself. Marta began adapting. For the Vick cabin, she sketched a reduced design, 5 feet by 6 feet, 3.5 feet tall, with a single sleeping bench instead of 2, and a shorter channel path that would hold heat for 10 hours instead of 16. The firebox stayed compact. The principle stayed the same. Only the mass changed. Each visitor who came to learn was a small victory. Each was also a threat to Elias Durney. Yes, Durney's reaction to the stove's survival was not gracious defeat. It was recalculation. If settlers built their own heaters from river clay and field stone, they would not buy iron stoves on credit. If they did not buy on credit, they did not owe him. If they did not owe him, he could not pressure them. The masonry heater was not just an appliance. It was an escape from the debt economy that kept Durney fed. He began the rumor in late January. He told settlers at his counter that clay stoves were safe enough in winter when the cold kept the body contracted, but that in spring thaw the moisture would return to the clay, the channels would weaken, and dead air, his careful borrowing of Marta's own term for carbon monoxide, would seep through the cracks while families slept. She built it in November, Durney told a man buying lamp oil. November clay, frozen in place. Come April, that clay thaws and the whole thing breathes poison. I've seen it happen with mud chimneys. Every spring, someone dies. The rumor was plausible enough to stick. Mud chimneys did crack in spring. Poorly built earthen structures did fail when frost left the ground. Durney was not lying about the general principle. He was lying about Marta's stove, which was built on a gravel pad below the frost line, tempered with sharp sand and old mortar, and fired slowly enough to cure the clay to near ceramic hardness. But the people hearing the rumor did not know these details, and fear moves faster than engineering. Reuben Fielding heard the rumor and contradicted it publicly at the same counter where Durney had started it. I inspected the stove, Reuben said. The body is sound. The channels are clear. I don't know everything about clay, but I know a cracked stove when I see one, and that stove isn't cracked. It was not a ringing endorsement. It was a blacksmith's professional assessment, delivered flatly in front of witnesses. It was enough to slow the rumor, but not enough to stop it. Durney shifted tactics. He did not repeat the spring thaw claim. Instead, he reminded Orrin through a note delivered by a hired boy that the $27 was due on February 15th. The mentor deepened in the weeks between the storm and the thaw. Peter Pechka had not left the Vale cabin during the blizzard's 3 days. He had slept on the floor near the west bench, eaten Marta's turnip soup, and helped Orrin haul wood from the pile in the blinding snow. When the storm broke, he had gone home to his own cabin, a tight, well-chinked structure near the river that he heated with an iron box stove and a cord of hardwood that cost him nothing because he cut it himself. He came back 2 days later, and 2 days after that, and by February he was coming every third day, not because the stove needed repair, but because the work interested him. They built together. The first project was a smaller prototype bench stove. the 5x6 design for the Vick brothers, assembled in sections on Marta's cabin floor so they could test the channel geometry before committing to a permanent installation. Pater cut stone for the firebox base while Marta shaped the clay channel forms. They argued about proportions. "The channel is too narrow here," Pater said, pointing to the second turn. "The gas will slow and the soot will build. In 2 years you'll have a blockage you cannot reach. If I widen it, the gas moves too fast and the heat passes through without transferring to the stone. Then add a roughness. Score the inside of the channel with a stick before it dries. The rough surface slows the gas without narrowing the passage." Marta stared at him. It was an elegant solution, using surface friction instead of channel width to control flow. Her father had used smooth channels in Bessarabia because the clay there was fine enough to polish. Dakota clay was coarser, and the coarseness could be made to work. "You learned that from wells," she said. "I learned that from water. Water and smoke are the same. They flow where you let them, and they slow where you make them." She scored the channel interior with a sharpened stick, dragging parallel grooves into the wet clay surface. When they fired the prototype in March, the second turn burned clean, no soot accumulation. The roughened surface caught the gas just long enough to strip its heat. They were partners in the way that two people who respect each other's competence become partners, not through affection first, but through the daily negotiation of problems that required both of their knowledge to solve. Pater knew Dakota materials, frost behavior, wind patterns, chimney dynamics. Marta knew fire, masonry geometry, thermal mass, and the inherited language of stove setting that her father had spoken with his hands. Together they could build what neither could build alone. Pater's backstory emerged in pieces, the way an old man's history emerges, not as narrative but as fragments triggered by the work. He had come from a farm near Kvamme in western Norway, where his father had built stone walls for sheep enclosures. He had learned plumb and level before he learned to read. He came to Dakota because the railroad wanted well diggers, and he stayed because the land was flat enough to see your own future, good or bad. He had buried a wife in 1879 and a son in 1882. He did not speak their names. Marta did not ask. She understood that some knowledge is held in silence, and that Pater's willingness to spend his remaining winters teaching a stranger's wife to build stoves was not separate from his losses, but because of them. He was building forward because he could not build back. In late February, Pater developed a cough. Not Alma's infant wheeze or Judson's deep bark. A low, rattling cough that sat in his chest and would not rise. He worked through it for 2 weeks, mixing clay and cutting stone and checking channels with his candle flame. But by March, the cough had taken his wind. He would pause mid-sentence, press his fist to his sternum, and wait for the fit to pass. His face turned the color of cold tallow during the worst episodes. Marta told him to rest. He told her to mind the clay. On March 12th, Pater came to the cabin carrying his plumb bob, a brass weight on a cotton string polished by 40 years of use, the tool that had trued every well shaft and chimney he had ever built. He set it on the bench beside the stove and unwound the string. "This ground lies," he said. "The frost moves it, the rain moves it, the wind packs one side and hollows the other. But the line does not lie, the line only knows down." He held the plumb bob out to Marta. The brass weight hung motionless, the string taut and vertical. She took it. The weight was warm from his hand. "You'll need this more than I will," he said. Marta closed her finger around the brass. She did not ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. She had watched her father's colleagues carry tools to the next generation, and she recognized the gesture. Peter Brecka died on March 29, 1888, in his own cabin, in his own bed, with his iron stove throwing heat he no longer needed. The cough had settled into his lungs and filled them with what the doctor in Huron called pneumonia, and what Pater, in his last coherent words to Orrin, called the winter collecting its debt. Marta did not attend the burial. She stood at her own bench stove and laid her hand against the warm surface where Pater had checked the channels with his candle. His lime dust was still in the cracks of the clay. His mallet marks were still visible on the foundation stones. The plumb bob hung from a nail above the firebox, its string vertical, its weight still, pointing at the center of the earth the way it had pointed for 40 years in the hands of a man who believed that accuracy was a form of kindness. She had lost her father at 14 and learned to build without him. She had lost Pater at 29 and learned to build without him. The lesson was the same both times. The teacher leaves, but the level does not change. Spring came hard and fast, the way it comes on the northern plains, mud and melt, and a sky that could not decide between rain and sleet. The ground thawed. The clay pit opened, and Marta watched her stove for the cracks that Durney had predicted. They did not come. The gravel pad held. The tempered clay, fired slowly through 4 months of daily use, had hardened to a density that resisted moisture. The lime wash sealed the surface. The channels were dry inside when Marta opened the clean-out door and reached in with a brush, dry and warm, holding the ghost of last night's fire, the way Pater had told her good stone holds the memory of the hand that set it. She proved the stove's spring integrity the only way that mattered. She kept firing it. Through March, through April, into the cool May evenings when the prairie grass turned green and the children finally stopped coughing. The chalk marks on the mantel grew into a record 4 months long. Wood weights, burn times, bench temperatures. A document written in lime dust that no one would ever publish and that proved to anyone who could read it that a stove built from river clay and inherited knowledge could outperform every iron box in the territory. November 1888 brought the secondary crisis. The schoolhouse sat 2 miles south of the Vale claim, a single-room frame building with a cast-iron stove that had been old when the school was built and had only gotten worse. The stovepipe connection leaked at the collar. The firebox door did not seal. The draft was poor because the chimney was too short, and the wind hit it from every direction on the open prairie. On November 9th, during an early freeze, the schoolhouse stove smoked badly enough to send the children home coughing. The teacher, a young woman from Sioux Falls, reported that the room had filled with gray haze within 30 minutes of lighting the morning fire. She had opened both windows, and the children sat in coats until noon, when she dismissed them. The school board, 3 men, including Elias Durney, met at Durney's store. Durney proposed purchasing a new iron stove. He had one in his back room, $32, freight included. The school fund had $19. Marta proposed a masonry heater built during the 3 days the school would be closed for the Thanksgiving break. She would design it. She would supervise the construction. She would need labor from the community, 4 strong people for 3 days. And materials: clay, stone, sand, lime, and a set of fired bricks for the firebox lining. She estimated the materials cost at $9. The school fund could cover it. Durney objected. A clay stove in a building full of children. If it smokes, if it cracks, if it fails in any way, those are not your children breathing the poison. Marta held Pater's plumb bob in her pocket. She could feel the brass weight against her thigh. The old stove smoked yesterday, she said. The children went home coughing today. The clay stove I built in my cabin has not smoked in 11 months. Which failure are you more afraid of, the one that already happened or the one you imagine? The school board voted 2-1. Durney was the one. The schoolhouse build was Marta's first project without Pater, and the first time she commanded a crew larger than Orrin. She had 3 days. She had 4 workers: Orrin, Reuben Fielding, Nettie Crowell, and a German-Russian settler named Emmerich Espelan, whose wife had studied Marta's flower drawings in January. She had $9 worth of materials already hauled to the schoolhouse yard. She applied Pater's lessons one by one. Gravel base dug below the floor line, 6 inches deep, rammed flat. Wind height chimney, Reuben welded an extension from salvaged flue tile and braced it with strap iron, the same method Pater had taught Orrin in November. Tempered clay, sharp sand, ground mortar, short-cut straw, mixed in the proportions Marta had refined through 6 months of testing. The schoolhouse stove was smaller than the cabin heater, 4 feet by 5 feet, 3 feet tall, with no sleeping benches. Children would not sleep at school, but with a broad, flat-top surface that could warm a kettle of water or a pot of soup for the teacher's lunch. The firebox was compact. The channels were scored with Pater's roughening technique. The clean-out door was iron, supplied by Reuben from his own stock, without charge. Nettie organized the women. 3 farm wives mixed clay in the schoolyard, their arms coated to the elbow in gray-brown river mud. They cut straw to 1-inch lengths. They carried stone from the pile Orrin had hauled. They did this not because Marta asked, but because their children sat in that schoolhouse every morning and the old iron stove had already failed. Clara, now 13, worked beside her stepmother for the first time in public. She had been watching Marta's hands for a year. She knew the clay mix by touch. Too wet and it slumped, too dry and it crumbled, right and it held the thumbprint without cracking at the edge. She mixed the final batch for the firebox arch, and Marta checked it and said nothing, which was the highest praise a stove setter gives. Reuben worked in silence. He was not a clay man, he was an iron man. But he set the flue connection with the precision of a blacksmith who understood that metal and clay must meet without gap, and he braced the chimney extension with strap iron tight enough to sing when the wind hit it. When Marta thanked him, he said, "Pater would have done it faster." "Pater would have done it differently," Marta said. "He would have used a wooden mallet where you used a wrench. The result is the same." By the end of the second day, the stove body was complete. By the evening of the third day, the lime wash was drying, and Marta had lit the first curing fire, the same gentle handful of kindling and split sticks that she'd used in her own cabin 11 months before. The schoolhouse stove did not smoke. The draft pulled clean and steady. The channels whispered behind their clay walls. The flat-top surface warmed slowly, evenly, and by the time the children returned on Monday morning, the room was 58 degrees and the teacher had not yet lit the day's fire. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who understands that the best time to build warmth is before the cold arrives. Durney's response to the schoolhouse stove was the response of a man watching his authority dissolve in public. He did not congratulate Marta. He did not inspect the stove. He called Orrin's note. The $27 was due on February 15th, and Durney had let it slide through the blizzard and the spring and the summer, because pressing it would have looked like cruelty when the town was burying its dead. Now it was November. The town had stopped burying, and Durney wanted his money or his leverage. He sent the note with a hired boy. Payment in full by December 1st. Failure to remit will result in legal remedy. Orrin read it at the table and set it down as if it were hot. $27. He had earned $11 from a late harvest of flax, and Marta had earned $4 mending chimneys for 2 families near Wessington Springs. $15 total, 12 short. The $12 gap sat on the table like a stone. What happened next was not charity and not dramatic. It was the slow, practical arithmetic of a community that had learned something during a blizzard. Nettie Crowell sent 2 bushels of wheat, worth $3 at the Huron elevator. Emmerich Espelon's wife brought $1.40 in coin. Saved, she said, from egg money she had not spent because the masonry heater in their cabin had cut their firewood cost enough to leave a surplus. Reuben Fielding brought $4 and said it was payment for the chimney work Marta had done on the schoolhouse, which was not true. Marta had not charged, but which Reuben offered as a professional courtesy between tradespeople, and Marta accepted it as such. The Vick brothers brought $1 each and a haunch of venison. A settler from near Woolsey, whose name Marta did not know, sent $2 through the mail with a note that said only, "For the stove woman," with thanks, $12.40. Orrin rode to Durney's store on November 29th and paid the note in full, in wheat, coin, and a venison haunch that Durney accepted because refusing it would have been refusing the community's verdict on his own behavior. Durney took the payment and wrote "paid" across the note. He did not look at Orrin. He did not ask about the stove. The note was gone. The debt was cleared. And Marta, who had come to Dakota Territory to be a practical woman, not delicate, had built something that the town could neither dismiss nor buy. By the spring of 1889, Marta Derringer had built 3 masonry heaters and supervised the construction of 2 more: the cabin stove, the schoolhouse stove, a bench heater for the Crowell farm, where Will still limped from frostbite, and where Nettie had decided that no child of hers would spend another winter warming one side of their body while the other side froze. The 2 supervised builds were the Espeland cabin near Woolsey, and a smaller cook stove heater hybrid for the Vick brothers, who had paid Marta in labor rather than money, 3 days of hauling stone in exchange for 3 days of her design work. Each stove was different. The Crowell heater was 6 feet by 7, with 1 sleeping bench for Will and a bake chamber that Nettie used daily. The Espelon stove was built partly in the German-Russian tradition. Mrs. Espeland insisted on a rounded firebox arch instead of Marta's flat-top design, and on a whitewash mixed with blue clay that gave the surface a faint gray-blue color. The woman said reminded her of her grandmother's backofen in the old colony near Odessa. Marta allowed every variation that did not compromise the channel geometry. The principle was not hers to lock. The principle was heat stored in mass, released slowly, and any shape that achieved that was correct. The Vick design was the tightest engineering challenge. 12 by 14 cabin, 5 by 6 heater with a single bench. The channel path had to make 3 turns instead of 4, which meant less surface area for heat transfer, which meant the firebox charge had to burn hotter to compensate. Marta increased the draft opening by 1/2 inch and scored the channel walls with deeper grooves. Pater's roughening technique pushed further than Pater had suggested. She tested the prototype on a windy March afternoon and found that the bench held 60 degrees at dawn after a 20-pound evening charge. Not as warm as the full-size cabin stove, warm enough to sleep. She kept notes, not the chalk marks on the mantel. Those were daily records, weather and wood and temperature. The notes she began keeping in a copybook Clara had given her for Christmas were design notes, channel widths for different stove sizes, clay to sand ratios for different soil sources, firebox dimensions indexed to cabin volume, chimney height minimums for different wind exposures. She wrote in German in a hand that was precise and small, and she drew elevation views with the mason's tools Jakob Derringer had given her and the plumb bob Peter Breka had placed in her palm. The copybook was not a patent application. It was not a manual for sale. It was the record of a craft that existed in Marta's hands and needed to exist somewhere else before the hands were gone. Teaching became part of the rhythm. Clara was the first and best student, At 13, she could judge clay moisture by squeezing a fistful and reading the crack pattern at the edge. She could cut straw to length without measuring by feel, the way a baker cuts dough. She could not yet lay a firebox arch. The brickwork required a strength and precision that her growing arms did not yet have, but she could mix, shape, score, and finish with a speed that made Marta's own hands look slow. Nettie learned the design but not the craft. She understood the channel drawings and could explain the principle to anyone who asked, heat stored in mass, short hot fires, slow release. But her hands were a farmer's hands, built for hoes and butter churns, not for the delicate work of shaping clay channel walls to the exact curvature that controlled gas flow. Nettie became something more useful than a builder. She became an advocate. When new settlers arrived in the district and asked about heating, it was Nettie who sent them to the Vale cabin before they went to Durney's store. 2 German-Russian women from near Woolsey came in April. They already knew earthen building. Their families had constructed thick-walled houses with combined furnace and bake ovens in the Black Sea colonies, but they had not adapted the technique to Dakota materials. Their clay was different. Their wind was different. Their fuel was different. Marta spent 2 days with them at the river cut, testing soil from 3 different banks, mixing test batches, firing test bricks. She taught them Peter's sand tempering method and his channel roughening technique. They taught her a mortar additive she had not known, horse dung mixed with ash, which bound clay at lower temperatures and was available in unlimited supply on any Dakota homestead. The exchange was not one-directional. Every person who came to learn brought knowledge that Marta absorbed and filed. The Vick brothers knew timber framing and showed her how to anchor a stove's chimney brace to the roof ridge with a notched joint instead of strap iron. Stronger, cheaper, and requiring no blacksmith. Reuben Fielding, who never built a clay stove himself, contributed iron clean-out doors from his shop, and each door was an improvement on the last drawing, tighter seals, better hinge points, a latch that could be operated with one hand while the other held a brush inside the channel. Knowledge moved outward from the Vale cabin the way heat moved outward from the stove, slowly through contact, accumulating in the material it touched. The winter of 1889 to 1890 was milder than the killing year, but it tested the stoves in a different way. A mild winter produces cycles, warm days followed by hard freezes, followed by thaw, followed by freeze again. The thermal cycling stressed the clay bodies more than steady cold, because each warming and cooling cycle expanded and contracted the masonry at different rates depending on moisture content. 2 stoves cracked. Not Marta's, the Espeland stove and one of the German-Russian stoves near Woolsey. The Espeland crack was a hairline fracture along the second channel turn, where the rounded firebox arch created an uneven stress point during rapid cooling. Marta rode to the Espeland cabin, inspected the crack, and patched it with tempered clay mixed with horse dung ash. She also modified the arch, flattening the curve slightly to distribute stress, and told Mrs. Espeland to change her firing pattern. Shorter fires, more frequent rather than one long burn. The Woolsey crack was worse. A fist-sized section of the outer wall had separated from the channel partition, opening a gap that leaked smoke into the room. The family had been firing green cottonwood, the same poor fuel that had plagued Orrin's original hearth, and the low burn temperature had allowed creosote to accumulate in the channels, which eventually ignited and overheated a section of poorly tempered clay. Marta rebuilt the damaged section in 2 days. She replaced the crumbled clay with a mix that included more sharp sand and a double layer of lime mortar between the channel wall and the outer body. She also cleaned every channel in the stove, extracting a bucket of black creosote soot that had built up over 3 months of dirty fuel. "Cottonwood burns dirty," she told the family. "If cottonwood is all you have, burn it hot and fast. A slow cottonwood fire poisons the channels. A fast one cleans them." She added a note to the copybook. "Green cottonwood requires higher draft setting and shorter burn. Channel inspection monthly minimum. Add creosote warning to all new builds." The cracks were failures, but they were instructive failures. Each one taught Marta something about Dakota conditions that Bessarabian experience had not prepared her for: the thermal cycling, the poor fuel, the ground movement. Each lesson went into the copybook, and each copybook entry became part of the next stove's design. By 1891, no stove Marta had built or supervised had cracked a second time. Elias Durney's final reckoning came in the winter of 1890 to 1891, and it came not through confrontation but through irony. Durney's store occupied a frame building on the Huron Road, larger than any homestead cabin but built to the same standard: single-wall construction, poor chinking, a chimney that had been adequate when the store was new and had deteriorated each year since. He heated the front room with a display model iron stove that served double duty, warming the store and demonstrating the product to customers. The back room, where he kept flour, sugar, fabric, and the ledger books that recorded every debt in the district, was heated by a smaller stove connected to the same chimney. On a night in late January, with the temperature at 14 below and the store closed, Durney overfired the display stove. He had been working late on his accounts, and the cold crept in, and he fed the firebox until the stove glowed at the seams, and the stovepipe connection turned the dull orange that every Iron Man knows as the color just before failure. The chimney flue, lined with 3 years of accumulated creosote from imperfect combustion, ignited. Not explosively. Chimney fires rarely explode. The creosote burned from the bottom up, a slow orange river inside the flue tile that superheated the mortar joints and cracked the tile at the second-story pass-through. Smoke poured into the back room. By the time Durney smelled it, the flour sacks nearest the chimney were scorched, and the fabric bolts were filling with smoke. He threw open the front door and shouted for help. Reuben Fielding and Orrin Vale were the first to arrive. Reuben because his shop was 200 yards west. Orrin because he had been in town trading flax. They hauled water from the horse trough and beat the smoldering flour sacks with wet blankets, while Durney pulled ledger books from the shelves and stacked them in the snow outside. The fire did not destroy the store. The chimney fire burned itself out once the creosote was consumed, and the structural damage was limited to the cracked flue tile and scorched framing around the pass-through. But the back room was unheatable until the chimney was repaired, and the front room stove, overfired, stressed, glowing, had cracked a plate along the seam where cast iron meets cast iron at the firebox corner. Durney stood in his damaged store and looked at the cracked stove and the smoke-blackened walls and the pile of ledger books melting snow in the yard. Marta arrived the next morning. She had not been asked. She came because Clara had heard about the fire from the Crowell children, and Marta understood that a storekeeper's chimney failure was a community problem, not a personal one. She inspected the chimney from inside and found the cracked tile. She inspected the stovepipe connection and found the gap where thermal cycling had opened the joint. She inspected the creosote residue and estimated the accumulation at 3 seasons' worth. Durney had never cleaned the flue. She told him what had happened, not with triumph, not with the satisfaction of a woman vindicated. She told him the way Petter would have told him, plainly, with specific details, and with the solution attached to the diagnosis. The flue tile is cracked at the pass-through. The creosote was 3 years thick. Your draft was poor because the chimney is too short for the wind exposure, and your stovepipe joint has opened 1/4 inch from expansion cycles. The display stove has a cracked firebox plate that will leak smoke until it is replaced or sealed. Durney listened. He did not interrupt. The men in the store, Reuben, Orrin, two settlers who had come to help, watched the exchange the way people watch any confrontation between pride and necessity. "What would you do?" Durney asked. Not, "What should I do?" That would have been asking for advice. "What would you do?" That was asking what she would build if she could build. "A masonry heater in the back room," Marta said. "It would heat the storage space evenly, reduce your fuel cost, and eliminate the chimney fire risk because the internal channels burn clean. The front room can keep the iron stove for display, but the chimney needs a new flue tile, an extended height, and annual cleaning." "How much?" "Materials for the backroom heater, $11. Labor, 3 days. The chimney repair, you and Reuben can do in an afternoon." Durney stood among his scorched flour sacks and his cracked stove and the smell of burned creosote, and he asked the question that had been building for 2 years. "You'd teach me this? After what I did?" He meant the rumors, the note, the public opposition, the attempt to discredit her work before it could threaten his inventory. Marta said, "The cold does not care who was right." It was not forgiveness. It was something more practical and more devastating than forgiveness. It was a woman who had been mocked, threatened, and undermined, offering the man who had done it the same knowledge she had given every other family in the district. Not because he deserved it, because the knowledge was not hers to withhold, because a storekeeper with a dangerous chimney was a community with a fire waiting to happen, because Peter Pechka had not asked whether people deserved wells before he dug them. Durney accepted. The masonry heater went into his back room in February of 1891, built by Marta, Orrin, and Reuben together. It was smaller than the cabin stove, 4 feet by 4 feet, no bench, a flat top for warming, and it heated the storage room evenly enough that Durney stopped losing flour to frost damage. He did not stop selling iron stoves, but he stopped telling people that clay stoves would kill them. Orrin and Marta's marriage became real the way a masonry heater becomes warm, slowly, through accumulation, not visible at any single moment, but undeniable over time. For the first year, they were partners in labor. Orrin hauled stone and clay. Marta designed and built. They spoke in the language of tasks. The clay pit is frozen. The chimney needs checking. The children need shoes before the snow. The intimacy was practical. They shared a bed because the cabin had one bed. They shared meals because someone had to cook and someone had to eat. The arrangement was functional, and Marta did not expect more because she had not come west for more. The change happened in small moments that neither of them named. Orrin stopped introducing her as "my wife who knows stoves." He began saying, "Marta designed it." The shift was from possession to credit, and Marta noticed it the way she noticed a change in draft, by its effect, not its announcement. He carved a second workbench and set it beside his own. Her bench was 3 inches lower, built to her height, with a tool rack along the back wall sized for mason's chisels, and a spirit level instead of carpentry tools. He did not present it. She came in from the clay pit one March afternoon, and it was there, smelling of fresh-cut ash, with the plumb bob hung on a nail above it. She stood in front of the bench for a long time. Then she set her tools on it and went back to work. They had a child in 1891, a boy, born in November, on the bench beside the stove, in a cabin that was warm enough for a midwife to work in shirt sleeves. They named him Jakob for her father. Orrin suggested it. Marta did not cry, but she rested her hand on the warm stone beside the baby and closed her eyes, and the warmth that came through her palm was the warmth her father had told her to trust when she was 6 years old in a whitewashed kitchen in Bessarabia. By 1894, 6 cabins, the schoolhouse, and Durney's store had masonry heaters or bench stoves built from Marta's designs. Each was different. Each was adapted to its cabin size, its family's needs, its location's wind exposure and fuel supply. The channel widths varied, the bench lengths varied, the firebox proportions varied. The principle did not vary. Clara, at 19, was the best clay mixer in the district. She could judge soil quality from a riverbank by color and by the way it held water, without digging. She could temper a batch of building clay in 40 minutes, working the sand and straw and mortar into the wet earth with her arms and a shovel, and the mix she produced was more consistent than Marta's own, tighter grain, fewer air pockets, a surface that took lime wash without patching. Judson, the boy who had been lost in the blizzard, was 15 and apprenticing with Reuben Fielding. He learned ironwork, hinges, door frames, clean-out plates, chimney braces, and every piece he made was tested against Marta's specifications. His clean-out doors sealed tighter than Reuben's. His chimney braces were lighter and stronger because he had watched Marta's designs evolve and understood that weight without function was waste. The Vick brothers had built a second stove in their expanded cabin and paid for it by teaching the construction method to a family near Iroquois, 40 miles south. The Espeland women were building stoves in the German-Russian settlements near Woolsey without Marta's supervision, using the copybook drawings Clara had recopied in ink and mailed to them. The knowledge traveled the way useful knowledge always travels on a frontier, hand to hand, family to family, adapted at each stop, improved by each builder, attributed to no one and belonging to everyone. Marta's name was attached to it loosely, the way a river is named for the place it starts, even after it has merged with a dozen tributaries and become something the source could not have predicted. Later years arrived in the compressed way that later years arrive, not day by day, but season by season, each one shorter than the last. Orrin and Marta proved up the claim. 5 years of residence and improvement, filed at the land office in Huron, documented with a neighbor's affidavit and a surveyor's sketch that showed the cabin, the summer kitchen Marta had added in 1892, and the cottonwood windbreak Orrin had planted along the north fence line. The land was theirs. 160 acres of Dakota prairie that had nearly killed them and that they had held by turning river mud into warmth. They added a second room in 1893. The children grew. Clara married a carpenter from Mitchell and moved south, but came back every November to help with the season's stove work. Judson opened his own iron shop in Huron, stamping clean-out doors with a mark that was half Reuben's design and half Marta's specification. Amos became a farmer. Thaddeus, the quiet one, became a school teacher and kept a masonry heater in every classroom he was assigned, building each one himself from his stepmother's copybook. Jacob, the youngest, grew up beside the stove. He learned to walk by pulling himself along the warm bench. He learned his letters by reading the chalk marks on the mantel. Deck 8, 20 Lobia's wood. Bench 58 eve, 54 dawn, before he understood what they meant. Winter gatherings formed around the whitewashed heater in the Vale cabin. Neighbors came not because they were invited, but because the cabin was warm, and the warmth was the kind that did not burn or sting or fade. The deep, even heat of stone that had been heated yesterday and was still giving back what it held. People sat on the bench and leaned against the wall and talked in the drowsy, honest way that people talk when they are warm enough to stop guarding themselves. New settlers were sent to the Vale cabin before they built a chimney. "Go see Marta Derringer," Nettie told them. "She'll show you the stove. She'll draw the channels. She won't charge for the knowledge." Marta showed them. She drew the channels. She did not charge. She became known less as a mail-order bride and more as the woman who could make a room hold fire after the flames were gone. The title was not official and not written anywhere. It was the kind of name that a frontier gives to a person who has solved a problem that everyone shares and no one else solved. A name spoken in kitchens and at store counters, and in the letters that settlers wrote home to families still deciding whether to come west. If you come, find the stove woman first. She'll keep you warm. On an afternoon in the late autumn of 1898, a young bride stepped down from a wagon at the Vale cabin. She had come from Ohio, the way Orrin had come from Ohio, answering a notice, carrying a trunk, holding the particular expression of a woman who has traded everything familiar for a promise written on paper. Marta met her at the door. The cabin was warm. The stove was white. The bench glowed with the residual heat of a fire that had burned that morning and would not need to burn again until evening. The young woman pressed her hand against the warm bench surface and smiled. The smile was recognition, not of the stove, which she had never seen, but of the warmth, which every human body recognizes without instruction. Marta did not explain everything. She did not lecture about channels or thermal mass or clay tempering or the difference between iron memory and stone memory. She reached into the drawer of her workbench and took out a length of mason's string, cotton like Petter's plum bob string, with a small weight tied at the end. She placed it in the young woman's hand. "First," Marta said, "find the center of the room." By the mid-1890s, Marta's heater pattern had spread through cabins around Huron and into neighboring settlements as far south as Iroquois and as far west as the Pierre Road. It traveled not as a patented design or a commercial product, but as copied practice. Drawings on flour-dusted tables, notes in copybooks, measurements scratched into barn walls and passed from one family to the next. One builder changed the bench length. Another added a second bake chamber. Reuben Fielding's apprentice, working from Judson's clean outdoor design, invented a hinged inspection plate that allowed channel cleaning without removing the door entirely. The knowledge survived because it was useful, because it cost nothing but labor and local material, and because Marta gave it away with the same stubbornness that Durney had once used to hoard it. Marta lived out her later years on the Vale claim. The cottonwoods Orrin planted grew tall enough to break the northwest wind, and the cabin that had once been a raw wood wound on the prairie became a weathered, solid house with whitewashed walls inside and out. She kept the copybook on her workbench until the pages were soft at the edges, and the chalk notations from the first winter, "Un saltoir en Dexteroway," 20 Elbiez Wood, Bench 58 Eve, 54 Dawn, had faded to ghosts that only she could read. She built her last stove in 1901 for a family near Wessington Springs, kneeling on the gravel pad with hands that ached at every knuckle but still knew the curve of a channel wall by touch. Reuben Fielding had called it first, standing in Durney's store in November of 1887, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who repaired every stove in the county. "A mud hill in the kitchen won't keep children alive. It'll smoke them like hams." But on the night of January 12th, 1888, when the sky became a wall and the temperature fell fast enough to kill cattle standing in fields, 5 children slept on warm stone in a cabin where the fire had gone out before midnight. The woodpile barely diminished. The chalk marks did not lie. And Marta Derringer's hand rested on the whitewashed bench, feeling the slow, stored heat her father had taught her to trust. The heat that stone holds the way a mother holds a child, not by gripping, but by refusing to let go. Years later, on that same bench, in that same spot where the youngest had once stopped shivering, a row of mittens dried above the sleeping place. Proof that the warmth had outlasted the woman who understood it, and the man who doubted it, and the winter that tested them both. The fire had gone out before midnight, but the house remembered it until morning.